Good. It'll be different. It'll be different than what you do. So hopefully. Okay.
All right. Good morning. Thank you for attending this last seminar of crew. Last seminar for this fall semester. My name is Florence Bouquet, and I'm the Managing Director for CREW, Center for Research and Education in Wind. Today's speaker is JayDiffendorfer of the Geosciences and Environmental Change Science Center. Jay received a BS in Wildlife Biology from Ohio University and a PhD in Ecology from the University of Kansas. He did his postdoctoral research at the University of Miami. Became then a tenured faculty at San Diego State University, and then worked as a landscape ecologist at the Illinois Natural History Survey. He is currently a supervisory research scientist at the Geosciences and Environmental Change Science Center, USGS. Jay's primary work focuses on energy development, particularly wind energy. The work includes understanding the environmental costs and benefits of energy production, developing a national map of wind turbines, understanding the causes and surface disturbance of wind facilities, and developing a method for siting energy production that minimizes environmental impacts. And with this, Jay's talk today is titled Understanding and Minimizing Wind Energy Environment Interactions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to the groundswell of folks that have shown up today. Hi, Karen. How are you? Good. Hi, Roger, if you're online. I named the title of this. I'm not going to be able to give you the exact answers of how to solve this problem, but this is a big sort of general theme for a lot of the work that USGS is involved in. We are a science support agency for other folks in the federal government, and we interact a lot with folks that are dealing with this issue, be it BLM, who's trying to figure out how to lay down new shale gas development on their lands in a way that minimizes impacts to endangered species, be it the wind industry that's trying to do the same thing, or trying to meet the requirements of these new wind energy guidelines that are out there. So there's this whole notion of how we do this, and a lot of the work I'm going to talk about focuses on this general topic. Oh, I need to use the mouse. Oh, down here, correct? Oh, I need to look at the screen. There we go. So briefly, this was already said briefly during my introduction, I postdoced at the University of Miami, where I was involved in developing landscape scale sort of models and simulations of reptile and amphibian communities and their response to different water management scenarios in the Everglades. That work, as well as work by the team that I was involved in sort of selecting the restoration plan for the Everglades. I then became a faculty member at San Diego State, where I got tenure and then left soon thereafter to Illinois. Just didn't want to live in San Diego more than anything else. And didn't have a problem with academia or anything like that. But there I was doing a lot of applied ecology. I was involved in habitat conservation plans, how we do management and monitoring those things. I did a lot of field-based work on food webs in coastal sage scrub and how they respond to things like habitat fragmentation, urbanization, and fire. I then moved on to the University of Illinois, the Illinois Natural History Survey at the time, which is now an institute within the University of Illinois. I did a lot of work on disease ecology, chronic wasting disease in deer, as well as amphibian declines and climate change. And then I began to develop, this is when I started developing an interest in larger scale issues. So I began to think about where do I want to be 30 years from now in this agricultural ecosystem. And I began to think about, well, how do we do stuff like produce all the food we need to produce in the Midwest, but not have a dead zone in the Mississippi? Big scale kind of questions. I sort of started moving away from the small scale stuff to bigger scale stuff. And when this job, we got a little bored of corn and soybeans in 200 miles in all directions in Illinois, so we moved here to USGS. And again, I was still interested in these broader topics, and the opportunity to begin to work in energy showed up, and so that's what I've been working on now. So, oops, I got to do this again, sorry. I got to keep moving here. So in reality, I've moved from basically field-based conservation biology to sort of this broader-oriented stuff on humans and their impacts on natural systems. It's really fun to sit on alligators. It's really fun to do field work. It's really fun to do that kind of stuff. But at some point in the back of my mind when I was doing all this stuff, I got a little tired of feeling like, the conservation biologist was called in to save the species after 50 years of bad land use planning, right? And I wanted to be sort of farther back in the process of decision making in terms of how humans interact with natural systems. And so that's sort of where I'm sort of moving now. So the outline for today is going to be basically a broad overview of energy-environment interactions and how we sort of study that, including some work that's happening at USGS. Then I'm going to talk about some work we're doing on surface disturbance and wind energy, work we're doing on wind turbine mapping, and then talk about a national assessment that USGS is beginning to work on assessing wind effects on wildlife. So this is a lot different than a lot of talks I'm used to giving, where I spend 45 minutes or 50 minutes talking about the minutia of like the results from one NSF grant. I've only been actively involved in wind research or energy research now for 3 years, and really the wind stuff for about 2. So there'll be some results here, but a lot of it will be sort of what I'm up to now. So let's talk about energy environment interactions. For me, you know, when I sit back and say, you know, what do you want to accomplish 20 years from now? When people ask you, well, what have you done over 20 years of your career? I think answering this question is an important one. How do we meet growing energy needs of humanity without undermining human and natural capital? To me, that's a big fundamental question. It's a fundamental question when we talk about sustainability. It's a fundamental question when we talk about the stability of nation states. It has massive implications for all kinds of things, not just having a nice, happy environment, right? So to me, you know, how do we go about doing that? Am I messing something up here? Oh, sorry. Okay, now I think I'm sharing. Sorry for those out there in the internet world. Can you see me now? If so, just type yes, Roger. All right, I think we're going. So how do we meet the growing energy needs of humanity without undermining human and natural capital? Well, I think we do this first by understanding the consequences of energy development and energy generation, and then using this information to inform policy. And that's pretty broad brushstroke. And I think to get there, we have to ultimately develop both an understanding of how energy development and energy generation affect systems, so that we can ultimately then develop methods that estimate the cost of benefits for something like this, shale gas, compared to this, centralized solar, compared to this, you know, an old school wind facility with a lot of road networks, right? So I think that's sort of the broad sort of interest and direction of where I'd like to go. And one of the things that you see happening now are these broad-scale, geographically based analyses of energy development. We're in some ways a very exciting time, I think, to be a scientist, in that we now have GIS, we now have very complex ways of modeling spatial data, and we now have methods of creating data sets at the scales of regions and nations that we didn't have like when I was in grad school. You know, I was doing I was working on the size of a football field, and people were like, "Whoa, that's a really big study." Right? And so now we can do things at the scales of nations, and that's pretty darn neat and pretty exciting. So this is an example of one piece of work that's going on with wind. This is not up here because I think it's a great piece of work or because I think it's a bad piece of work, but this is an example of some work that was recently published. The stuff in green is basically mapped areas or modeled areas where this group of folks think there'll be low impacts if you develop wind there. Okay, so it's a combination of A, where the wind resource is, and B, where the biodiversity isn't, in a sense. And so it's basically like, if you develop here, your chances are you're going to have less impact if you develop someplace else. And then the purple and the pink are places where there's either existing or proposed wind turbines. So this is sort of one general way that says, if you put stuff in green, you might minimize impacts on wildlife. Okay, this is sort of like a broad scale, some people call it a tier 1 based sort of approach. The other thing that's another example of these broad scale approaches are habitat conservation plans that are being developed for wind energy. Habitat conservation plans are basically permitting processes in which some entity, typically industry, interacts with the Fish and Wildlife Service to try and get permits to harm or to take species, right? When I was in Southern California, it was basically real estate developers looking to get assurances that if they develop a new set of homes out on some nice coastal sage scrub, that they wouldn't be sued, right? So they wanted to get a take permit. In order to convince Fish and Wildlife Service that that's going to happen, you have to prove to them that your overall plan for development is going to not appreciably reduce the likelihood of survival and recovery of the species. Okay, so they're developing habitat conservation plans in 2 different places for wind right now. One is in the Midwest, and that permitting process is supposed to cover about 30 species, though I'm not sure if that list of species is totally codified yet. And there's another one being involved in the sort of the Central Flyway for whooping cranes and a few other species, and I think terns. So this is the sort of spatial scales that we're talking about, a multi-state sort of spatial planning area. So the idea is that the set of companies that are approaching the Fish and Wildlife Service with this plan will say, we'd like to develop wind in this area, and in the process of doing that, we're not going to appreciably harm the species because we're going to be doing other things. We're going to avoid places where the animals are. We're going to do special operations to reduce impacts to wildlife, or we're going to do habitat conservation in other parts of the region that will basically counteract any take we might have on the species. And so I've been involved since I've been at USGS, either deeply or sort of indirectly, or actually, let's put it this way, I was involved in all these things, but not for long in some of them. So these are all larger scale, kind of geographically based sort of attempts to look at energy and environment interactions. The Wyoming Landscape Conservation Initiative is one. I was involved in that when I first got here. They had to put me on something, so they put me on that. And I was there for about a year. I was involved in a group working with BLM to do these rapid ecoregional assessments. What you're trying to do there for large ecoregions that BLM has a lot of land in, they're interested in knowing and identifying places where they should allow energy development, where they should not allow energy development, and where they should restore habitats to counteract the effects of energy development. Sort of the big, broad goal of these rapid ecoregional assessments. I'm going to talk a little bit about the PAL Center working group because this was one thing that I was deeply involved in. I co-led this working group, and the idea was to work on what we're calling integrated energy and mineral assessments. So the PAL Center is a science synthesis center, just like the National Science Foundation funded National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, or the new National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center. It's a USGS funded place up in Fort Collins. Basically, groups of scientists, it could be anybody in this room, get together, you write a proposal to do something integrative and synthetic. If it gets funded, it's summer camp for scientists. You all get together, you're paid for room and board, you meet 3 to 4 times over 2 years, and you think about big problems. And you have a lot of fun doing it. So I co-led this gaggle of individuals with a person named Seth Haynes. He's the guy in the middle with the beard and the green little neck strap on. It included some environmental scientists, some economists, 2 economists right here, some national leaders in both mineral and energy assessments, a policy person, an individual from BLM that's working on large sort of landscape ecology issues and planning from the National Operations Center, the head of renewable energy for Fish and Wildlife Service, Tim, who's now retiring, 2 water people. This is an individual who's from NREL. He's a policy analyst at NREL. There's the bozo me that was stupid enough to try and put all these people together in the same room. 2 leaders from USGS, Energy Program and Minerals Program, a theoretical ecologist, etc. So a wide multidisciplinary group of individuals. Our goal was to basically develop a method to link the assessments that USGS does of energy and minerals to the consequences of their extraction. Okay, that was the goal. The first meeting, the minerals and energy people almost walked out. They have a way of thinking about assessments that's very different than the way environmental scientists do. This was very difficult to make this group of people constructively talk to one another. It's amazing how I had no idea interdisciplinary work was going to be so hard, and it was. And it wasn't because we had odd personalities in the room. It was just difficult. So to give you a little bit more detail on this, so this is a shale gas assessment that USGS recently published. So what they do is the geologists all get together, they amass a whole bunch of data, and they say, this is what we know about the geology of the region to tell us, this is sort of our geologic model of what's gone on underground over the last, couple billion, not billion, millions of years, to tell us that we think we can do an assessment in this polygon that you see right here. They take that geological model then and they ultimately use it to make outputs, to make estimates of outputs of how much stuff is underground. And the interesting thing about these assessments is that they're probabilistic in nature. So if you look right here where it says F95 under gas, so they're saying there's a 95% probability that there's at least 20,000 billion cubic feet of gas under that area. But there's a 5% chance that there's almost 3 times that, right? There's a 5% chance there's 60,000 cubic feet of gas under there. There's a mean of about 37 billion cubic feet. So our goal is to say, well, if they develop 20,000 billion cubic feet of gas, if they're going to suck that much stuff out of the ground in that area, what's the potential consequences of doing that? USGS was criticized for not having this as part of their assessments that they do. So that was what we were tasked to figure out. And the must-haves that came out of all this machination. It needs to be applicable at multiple spatial scales. It needs to include uncertainty in the output, so carry that uncertainty that's already there with the assessment into the outputs. The economists insisted that it support economic valuation, and we can do that. There's some folks already in the energy and minerals team that do economic valuation of these reserves, but not necessarily cost-benefit analysis of the impacts on the environment or on culture or on humans relative to the benefits of producing the energy. And then it needs to support planning via either forecasts of where the energy might go or the prioritization of locations. So this is basically a schematic of what we're talking about. In the your lower left, you have the resource assessments I just talked about. Over here on the right, you have constraints. So those are geographic constraints about where energy might go. And we can get those from BLM's management plans, for example. They have plans of where they want to put stuff versus not already on the books. They have areas that are off limits, so to speak, to development. You throw that into some kind of Monte Carlo simulation, and you get spatial build-outs of forecasts. Spatial build-out forecast, sorry. For that entire polygon, you might get an estimate of how many wells might go in there, right? But if you work on it a little bit more, you can get spatial build-outs of forecasts. If you're willing to accept a little bit more looseness and develop sort of a spatially explicit well pad simulator or something like that. I just saw some talks last week at a wind conference where people are trying to do this with wind. I've got a colleague who's doing it with oil pads right now for Southwest Wyoming. And then you link those things to whatever potential impact you feel like modeling, be it biology, hydrology, air quality, etc. So that's where we're going with this. So to do these things, though, requires some kind of relationships or empirical evidence of impact. So here's one that Seth Haynes, my collaborator, has developed for wells in the Bakken Formation. This is the amount of water it takes to complete a shale gas well. All right, so that's the distribution of water in millions of gallons of water. And this is from a dissertation by a fellow named Matt Holleron, where you're looking at the change in male lek attendance by proximity to active drilling. Now, leks are places where sage grouse congregate to mate. For some reason, the males decide that place looks good. They all show up there. They run around. They beat their chest. The females decide if they want to mate with them, and then reproduction takes place, and then they all go off and babies run around and they do their thing. So what this data shows is when you get out from 10 kilometers or farther inward, you begin to get less and less males attending leks, and lek attendance falls, and the big concern is that eventually a lek is abandoned in that particular place of the population. There's no longer any breeding or reproduction for that particular part of the population. So yeah, if you have data like this, you can begin to do stuff in this sort of context of linking the resource to the impact. So, but before you do that, you still have to figure out how much infrastructure is going to be on the ground. And this is some work that Sarah Hawkins down here and Troy Best from the energy team at USGS have just devised. This takes those energy assessments and takes some additional information that they get from well pads about how much area a particular well drains underground, right? So you get what they call a cell size. So you can break that polygon up into cell sizes, and those might vary, and there's a distribution for those. But you take that information, and then you can give an estimate for this particular reserve, in this case the Mesa Verde. There's a 90% chance that they're going to basically develop about 2,400 wells, 2,500 wells. But there's a 10% chance that they might develop 4,700 wells, right? And this is all based on what's underground. You can then also say, well, if they develop these wells, where are those wells going to go? Are they going to be infilling in between existing wells? Or are they going to go to new places on the landscape in that polygon that might result in new impacts? And so in this case, there's a 90% probability of wells expanding over 100,000, 180,000 acres in that area, but there's a 10% probability that it might go up to 350,000 acres in that area. So if you have information like that, then you can do something like this. You can take a map where you have cells where you know the resource exists, and so there's a probability of wells share. The axes are where there already are wells. So you can take that. You know where your leks are. You have the information about when leks begin to be affected by wells, and then you can come up with the probability of lek loss across the landscape. So we've developed the framework. We know where we want to go with this. We're trying to find some money to do this in the Piceance Basin, which I think is in my next slide. I think I'm talking ahead of myself. Yes, I am. So bottom line, these geospatial methods are really useful, I think, for regional scales analyses. Oftentimes, basic fundamental information to run them is lacking, so you have to go out and do it. And that's some of the reasons why you'll see some of the work I'm going to be talking about with wind. And the data management needs are extremely high. If you want to begin to, particularly if you want to begin to take, for example, these USGS assessments of, say, shale gas and link them across regions so you can do a larger scale assessment across multiple places, you really have to, it's really tough. I mean, the data are buried in these things. They're not sitting in some nice electronic file that you can just write some code to grab them. You have to go in and find page 45, talk to the geologist and say, is this the right page? And they say, yes, no, maybe, I don't know. They actually go to page 47, sort of like that. So it's not easy, but I think we can do it. So we're trying to do it in the Piceance Basin here in Colorado right now. We're working as best we can. with no funding, and we're trying to get some funding to make it work. So now I want to switch over to the wind research. So the big picture I just gave you is sort of the general motivation for a lot of my work in wind. I'm really interested in comparative analyses between wind and solar and other forms of energy, and then these geographic analyses of wind energy as well. So these are the sort of general research topics I'm interested in. I'm not involved in these at all of them. Siting and planning, efficiency of energy generation, wake effects, the comparison to other forms of energy, and then impacts on wildlife are all things that I'm sort of interested in or involved in one way or the other. So let's talk a little bit about surface disturbance and wind energy. So when I first got into this stuff and I wanted to do the comparative work, I really thought surface disturbance was going to be the one thing that I could just pick up and compare across all these different energy types and begin to do comparative analysis. I went to the literature. You get estimates of sort of energy produced per mountaintop remove for mountaintop removal mining in West Virginia. You can pick up some of these things. And then when I got to wind, I realized that it's not quite as easy as I thought to get wind stuff figured out. This is my literature review of estimates of wind. And you can see it varies tremendously, in part because people measure it differently. So the cluster of studies up here are people that only measured the roads and the infrastructure. And the people below are different ways of pulling out what you might call the project area. You can draw a polygon around a cluster of wind turbines and call that the project area. And there's lots of different ways to draw that circle. And so it really affects what you see. But even when people are just looking at roads and infrastructure, you get a huge amount of variability, from 0.06 hectares per megawatt to 2.4 hectares per megawatt. So this Denholm study is someone that Karen probably knows. I've never met Paul, but he's an analyst at NREL and did this wonderful study where he got, I don't even know where he got all these EIRs, the environmental impact reports for a bunch of wind facilities, and pulled in the information about estimated impacts from those and did this really nice analysis of it. So this was really cool to me. What really struck me was the amount of variability across space, or across facilities and across the literature in this. And it struck me. So the other thing that struck me was that none of this data came from installed wind facilities that I could tell. I mean, there were a few of the old ones where people did some estimates, but when you really dig into that literature, no one actually went out and measured surface disturbance on installed wind farms. And that bothered me. I'm enough of an empiricist. I might have missed something, but I didn't see it. So I decided it's time to actually estimate surface disturbance from working facilities and also explain the variation. I'm really fascinated in why there's so much variability across these facilities. Because if you can figure out why there's all this variability, it might help you think about ways to install a whole bunch of gigawatts of wind and minimize the surface disturbance while you're doing that, which is a big concern. There's these new wildlife turbine siting guidelines that, Karen, you were involved in that planning process. And one of the things that Fish and Wildlife talks about a lot in these guidelines are area-sensitive species, or species that are going to be sensitive to habitat fragmentation. So if you can figure out a way to reduce that, the surface disturbances as you install your wind, you're in good shape. So what we did is we mapped surface disturbance at 39 facilities. A colleague named Roger Compton, who's online, went pretty much crazy doing all this surface disturbance mapping. Roger's in there. It took him about 2.5 years. Thank you, Roger. And we stratified these by turbine size, land cover, topography, and configuration. So we looked at them in that way. We then modeled disturbance. We obviously digitized all the disturbance at those sites, surface disturbance. We modeled that using general linear models in an information theoretic approach. We then estimated the AIC weights for each one of these potential coefficients and did model average estimations for these explanatory variables. And then we performed this analysis at 3 different spatial scales associated with wind facilities. And I want to go through that spatial scale issue just a little bit. So this is the Kibbe Mountain Phase 1 facility in Maine. And that little line there in blue is to remind me to talk about that being a transmission line cut. Okay, a new transmission line was cut through the forest there for that facility. And there's also a new road that goes over to the left. And the reason this gets tricky is that for Kibbe Mountain, that's a 33 kilometer long new cut through woods. And the reason I think they went ahead and made that investment is I think they're planning on a whole bunch of additional wind facilities along that ridge. So in the long run, it's worth that investment in infrastructure. But when you look at the entire scale of the facility like this, what you find is, we could map all this and call this a surface disturbance and associate it with a certain amount of energy produced. What we found, though, was these these connections, so to speak, to the outside world, be they either transmissions or new roads out to, say, a highway or something like that, are very idiosyncratic in terms of some facilities have them, some facilities don't. Only about maybe a third of our facilities had them. And they really muck up the statistics if you throw this in, right? So we also then did, well, let's look at the facility only without these long connections out to the rest of the world, right? So we did things at what we're calling the site scale, and that would basically be everything you see here except for the little grid connection coming out this way, and basically starting right here in red, which is the new road that came out for it. So that would be the facilities, or the site scale. And then we did things at the turbine and road spatial scale as well, and we called those strings. So the stuff in blue are strings. So these are basically turbines and the roads that connect them, right? So roads that connect groups of strings or underground cables were not included in the string scale. So you can get a little bit of the detail that Roger digitized here. We have hard surface, which is the dark blue, for example, and then other forms of disturbance that aren't hard, hardened material. This is a little cutout to a meteorological tower, for example. So anything that was new infrastructure or new disturbance associated with the wind facility, we digitized. We also digitized pre-existing road networks and subtracted pre-existing from post. So we're only getting the actual new impacts from the facilities. Okay, so come on. So facility scale disturbance. So we estimate that this overall giant, the overall facility scale, 0.92 hectares per megawatt. And this is really good agreement with the mean across all those published studies that were in the top part of that table. They're 0.95. So that gives me faith that the estimates that go into environmental impact reports are pretty much good, right? That was nice. But what's more important is what explains all this variability. We observed from 0.11 to 4.3 hectares per megawatt, right? That's a lot of spatial variability. Previous studies showed 0.06 to 2.4. So, there's still a lot of variation to explain out there, and can we explain it? So here's sort of what our model selection tables look like. So we have different general linear models. This is a model that has land cover and topography in it. This would be a model that has land cover, topography, and turbine size, for example. So we have these different types of models with different, obviously, numbers of parameters. Here's the AIC value, which is basically a measure of model fit, if you want to call it that. And then here's the AIC weight and the model likelihood. So this is a way of, this information theoretical approach is a way of contrasting or comparing various models. What you can do when you have a series of models like this is you can estimate an AIC weight for the various explanatory variables and see which ones come out as showing up over and over again as having the most support. In this case, it was land cover and topography. It had much more support than turbine size or string configuration. And again, this is at the scale of sites. Oops. And so if we look at this, we see the following. Nothing here is not what anybody doesn't expect already. So if you put wind facilities in tilled landscapes where they use existing road networks that are already hardened to deal with combines and truckloads of grain, lots of weight, it doesn't take a lot of additional roads and infrastructure to put in, or surface disturbance to put in wind in these places. If you put it in forest habitat where there's not a lot of roads already, it takes a lot more. Okay, not surprising. I think anybody could have told you this, right? Same thing with topography. You put things on flat areas, your roads can be fairly straight. They don't have to follow the contours of hills. These basically all lump together into something that we might call hilly. And it depends really on what we call ridge lines or what we call mesas. But basically everything above here is sort of hilly, and this is flat. So put stuff on flat land, you don't have a lot of impact. Have to have curvy roads, or you get erosion down the sides of slopes where you put stuff in, and you get more disturbance. So nothing here is really new and groundbreaking. But I think what is good about it, there's 2 points. One, don't trust point estimates of surface disturbance, particularly when someone takes them to make forecasts about future energy impacts, right? If they're not going to put a range of variation out there, don't trust it, okay? There's massive amounts of variability, and it depends on where you put your wind on the landscape, right? So if we put all the new wind in America on tilled landscapes, it's going to have a very different footprint than if we put all the wind on mountains, right? So ranges of variation are important for the forecasts. Second, we now have the ability to predict the footprint of wind facilities given 2 simple geospatial layers, one on land use, one on sort of topography, and some very simple facility information. So we can begin to make predictive maps about this stuff. And here would be the equation, for example, given the current sort of data that I ran, I want to rerun these equations with more standardized geospatial layers that we can then use to extrapolate across the nation. But we can begin to predict this in a geospatial way pretty easily, I think. So that's the next round of work on this stuff. So let's talk about wind turbine mapping. The goal here is pretty straightforward. Develop a map of all commercial wind turbines and facilities in the United States. And we're going to shoot for turbines installed prior to 12/31/2012. Why are we doing this? Well, when we started trying to do some of this facilities level work, we just couldn't find good data. And maybe it's out there. Karen, maybe NREL has it, but we haven't found it. So I'm funded to do this. So it's basically what this really becomes is an amalgamation exercise. I never thought I'd be a map maker. This is kind of funny. So when I got to the Geography Science Center at USGS, I'd meet people in USGS and say, oh, you work for geography, you make maps. I'm like, no, we don't make maps, we do science. And now I'm making maps. So here I am. So it's really an issue of A, combining turbine data sets with facilities data sets into some kind of final geodata set. So what turbine data sets are out there? Well, the big one is FAA. So FAA has this thing called the Flight Obstacles data set. Anybody making something above 92 feet is supposed to stick it into the FAA data set. I think it's 92 feet. You can pull out the wind turbines from that, and you can get an estimate of where the turbines are. It's all voluntary, so some of them are in there and they're perfectly on the money. Some of them have coordinate-based offsets where they use the wrong coordinate system, so all the turbines are shifted by 10 meters or something like that, 15 meters. So there's FAA data, and that's got a lot of facilities in it. It's really good start. Department of Homeland Security has an infrastructures data set that we have access to as part of the federal system. NGOs, states, and universities all have done different levels of mapping at different sort of spatial scales. So there's a lot of different turbine data sets out there that vary in their quality and their degree of accuracy and the extent. Facilities oh man, I don't know why that happened. Anyhow, facilities data sets. Again, the Energy Information Administration has I think they call it like a energy generating facilities data set or something like that. It has all the different facilities in America that produce electricity. You can pull out wind and solar and other things from it. Department of Homeland Security again. EPA has one. Oak Ridge National Labs developed one as part of a website called Wendy, which seems to be gone right now. I think they ran out of money, and so you really can't find it on the internet. Maybe they're back. Maybe it's back up. States have their own in some cases, like California, though they might not want to release it to us. And then the American Wind Energy Association has recently put one out that's fairly up to date. They want $5,000 for it, so we'll see. I have to talk to them a little bit more. So there are mapping issues. So to summarize the big mapping issues, we need to verify turbine locations with aerial imagery. And sometimes this actually requires new image collect, so tasking satellites to take pictures in places where you know there's facilities but there's not updated imagery. Find facilities and turbines that are not in the FAA, verify and measure facilities information, and link turbines to the facilities. So to give you some idea of what I'm talking about and where we are, this is a little tricky to see, but I think you can see it. So what you're seeing here is our current status as of, I think, was that yesterday? 2 days ago. Roger got this for me. What we see are places in red that we have not yet edited, places that are in blue that are spatially okay. We verified the locations, but we don't have all the attributes for the turbines yet. So our turbine data set will have attributes, the size of the turbines, you know, how many megawatts it is, what the manufacturer is, et cetera, et cetera. So those are places where we don't have all the turbine information. 0, or the light yellows, you probably can't even see them. These are unedited because we need new imagery for them. They're things that were installed so recently that there's no publicly available data for them. And we have to go out and task a satellite to shoot a picture for us before we can do that. 3 are ones that are, the green ones are ones that are complete. And then 4 is where we think there's a facility, but we don't know if there's any turbines there. So a facility database tells us there's potentially a facility there, but we don't have any imagery to prove that, or it's not an FAA, one of the two, right? Okay. This is the facilities data set, and it's obviously a little messy. So if all these different data sources, and I don't know if that title's quite right, because Wendy and Oak Ridge National Labs, I think, are the same thing. So I'm not really sure what's going on with that title. But if all these guys had accurate geospatial data for facilities locations, a lot of these would be sticking on top of each other. And as you can see, they're not, right? So this is going to be a lot of work to try and get the facilities data sort of figured out. This is a close-up of some of the examples you see. So this is a site in northern New York. Here's a blow-up of it over there in the left corner. So what you see is you see 4 named facilities in the data sets, but 8 different locations. Okay. If you add up in the facilities databases how many turbines that should be, it should be about 256, but we only see 224. And the turbine counts vary by facility, and when you look at the databases as well. So how many turbines are associated with a particular facility varies by what database you're looking at. And so we've got 2012 imagery ordered. Hopefully we'll sort this out. But we're going to have to really do some, I don't know what we're going to ultimately do to get to the facility level data. I mean, we might have to get county level permitting data to really figure this out. I'm hoping that the American Wind Energy Association has this level of information and is willing to work with us, but we'll find out about that. Here's an example in Central Texas. Here's about 4,019 turbines. Some of these are nicely associated with facilities and tend to match up, and other ones don't. And we see the same kind of thing over here in another area where there's a lot of wind development in the Columbia Plateau. And I wrote this to remind myself, real facilities with no turbine data, or are these what I'm calling spatial flukes? So this point here, are there really turbines there? And we just don't have the imagery and they're not in FAA yet, and we need to go find out? Or should that point actually be right here as it's part of that cluster of wind turbines, right? So that's the kind of stuff we're going to have to work out, and that's going to be time consuming and difficult to do. So we're going to release this thing to the public in multiple steps. We know a lot of people that just want accurate turbine locations. So version number 1 will just be that. FAA plus whatever else we can find, all visually verified using 1 meter or 1 to 2 meter visual aerial data, imagery, sorry. Version 2 will be a first attempt at linking turbines to facilities, and version 3 will hopefully be our final product. The cadre of folks on this, which I think are all right here. Roger is the main USGS person. He's our data steward and the main kind of guy keeping track of this project. And then 4 different student interns, all from Denver University, some getting master's degrees, some just getting GIS certificates. This cadre of folks is insisting they can have all the stuff corrected, all the visual stuff done at turbines done in about 3 or 4 months. They've gotten 25,000, over 25,000 turbines done in about 2 months already. So they're fast and they're good. We're going to run into issues with satellite imagery. So we're lucky at USGS in that we have, particularly in my science center, we have people that can actually task satellites. We have contracts with commercial satellite vendors, and we can say, please take a picture on this part of the world if your satellite's not tied up doing other things. We get in a queue, and we eventually get the image sent to us. So we've got about 149 of those requests in right now. It's kind of made them scratch their head. They're a little nervous about getting it done for us, but that's where we're at. So it's moving forward. So if we have this completed map, what are we going to be able to do with it? So I've been having discussions with a fellow named Somnath Bhattaroy at University of Illinois. He's a meteorologist. He's done some real neat work looking at how turbines downwind, or how turbulence associated with turbines affects micrometeorology downwind from facilities. And he and I have been talking about ways to, once we have all these turbine points, are there ways to at least begin to geographically model areas around facilities that might be potentially impacted by these micrometeorological impacts of wind. It's the actual fundamental science, if you want to call it that, behind micrometeorological effects of wind is still very much in the air. He's got field trials going on. He's got an NSF-funded project where he's using MODIS satellite to look for surface temperature differences pre and post construction. So there's a lot of basic work that needs to get done, but that doesn't mean we can't begin to model that polygon around facilities that might be impacted, given what we know about the average wind rows or the wind rows information around a facility, the size of the turbines, and the ambient background sort of environmental variation that's going on. I'm really fascinated in looking at a geographic analysis of factors affecting wind energy generation. So we know that you can get energy generation data, at least EIA, on these facilities. You can then get an estimate of overall efficiency, and you can begin to ask questions about other geographic factors that affect the efficiency of wind facilities. If we're going to put out, if we want a whole bunch of market penetration for wind in America, if we want to do it with the minimum number of turbines, then we want to put them in places where we're getting the maximum amount of efficiency out of them, right? Otherwise, we're going to have to put in more turbines to get the same amount of energy. So I think it'd be interesting to begin to look at this question. And then there's some work, obviously, on wind and wildlife that we can begin to do when we have better turbine data. All right, so let's talk now about developing assessment methods. And I go till noon, so I'm in good shape. All right, developing assessment methods. So this is a project that I recently agreed to be a co-lead on. It's part of the Secretary of Interior's National Energy Frontier Initiative. So the Secretary of Interior and the Obama administration is big on renewables. They'd like to get more renewables up and running. They want to make sure they do it in a way that minimizes environmental impacts. So this is kind of an interesting project in that it's led by the Energy Resources from USGS. So I'm kind of the ecologist involved in a project that's primarily run by energy. And the energy folks are the ones that do those shale assessments that I talked about earlier in the talk. And the reason I think that the energy team ultimately got the nod at USGS, I don't know what really happened in Reston. There's a lot of ecologists in USGS, but the energy program got the nod to do this. And I think it's because at an institutional kind of organizational level, they're the only entity in USGS that has this long history of doing these institutionalized, standardized approaches for coming up with assessments that include the probabilistic statement and deal with uncertainty. Ecologists have been doing risk assessments and all kinds of modeling that include quantitative probabilistic statements of impacts for a very, very, very long time. But they're doing it in USGS on sort of a scientist by scientist level. And the energy team at USGS does it in this sort of standardized way. So for example, the methodologies they do for the energy production has been vetted over a 5-year process of development and then vetted by the, what do they call it, the American Institute of Petroleum Engineers or something like that. You know, so it's this very concrete, and it needs to be because head of the energy program almost got fired one time because the Texas suddenly didn't have as much energy as it had the year before, right? And a few senators didn't like that. So there needed to become a very standardized methodology that you could show to people and say, this is why our energy estimates changed. So they've been doing this for a while, and they have a reason for doing it. My co-leads are Margot Coram and Matt Merrill. Both of them have been involved in leading these huge multi-sort of investigator teams successfully through some of these stuff. Matt and USGS is about to produce, or I think they have the draft report done on carbon sequestration. So how much carbon CO2 can we pump into the ground across the nation, given the geological formations that exist already in America? So Matt was a key in turning that project around and making it happen. Our goal is to have a draft review in March of 2015. One of the reasons I've been hectic in some of my emails to you is that I was at meetings just earlier this week with one day of meetings with industry and one day with NGOs talking about this assessment methodology. There was also a meeting in March before that Karen was a part of that was kind of a broader, we got into some sort of more detailed stuff in the last 2 days, but the one that Karen was at was very much a room full of people that were kind of just all talking kind of in all kinds of directions. And we got stuff out of it, but it was kind of at the same time very broad brushstroke in the discussions. So the meetings with both NGOs and industry went better than I expected, to be quite honest. So it was good. So the overall goal then is to develop a methodology to assess the impacts of fish and wildlife from large-scale development of onshore state waters wind energy in the U.S. using a probabilistic quantitative approach. We're doing a lot of information gathering. Right? Oh, so these are the general steps that the energy program uses when they develop these things. They do information gathering. They then develop a draft assessment methodology. And actually what they oftentimes do is they draft up multiple assessment methodologies. They then throw them to both internal and external scientific review and just ask people to like blast holes in these things, you know. Just really give us a lot of feedback and really try to knock these things down. And then they use that as constructive comments, standard peer review stuff, and come up with a better assessment methodology. All right. So what have we heard so far? Particularly yesterday, or sorry, it wasn't yesterday, it was 2 days ago. Particularly the last 2 days in DC, people want us to deal with population level consequences to individual species, which means we first have to figure out a way to figure out what species we're going to deal with versus those that we don't think are going to be impacted. So we have to come up with some kind of filtering mechanism first, and then for those species that we think there's going to be a wind impact, we need to come up with ways to do this. There's actually people that have, and I'm missing a figure over here, but that's okay. So there's sort of a continuum of modeling complexity that you can think about to do this. On the one hand, if you have, and some people have, I was recently at a meeting last week in Broomfield, the National Wind Coordinating Committee, I never get that right. So they had a wind and wildlife conference. And there were some people there that produced estimates that look like this. They said, well, let's look at the mortality data of dead birds that we find underneath turbines. Let's take that information and estimate then a per megawatt kill rate for a particular bird species or all the passerines or something like that. Let's then multiply that by all the megawatts in a particular area and estimate the total number of birds we expect to be killed. Let's then divide that by the population size of the birds in that region and just see what the percentage is. If it's 0.00001% of the population, there's probably not an issue, right? If it's 5% of the population, maybe you need to be concerned, right? So that's sort of at the very, very, coarsest way to do this. There's other people that are beginning to work on using ecological models. Down here represents what's called population viability analyses. These are stochastic simulation type models where you put in information about bird biology or whale biology, whatever species biology you want, and you end up with a statement here that says, for example, well, you can't even read this, everybody, but this is the percent of decline in the population, and this is the probability of that decline. So you get a probabilistic statement of the decline in the species. And so people have been talking about using these kinds of analyses, and actually there's some being done to look at wind impacts. And another one, I have this curve here because this reminds me to talk about what's called maximum sustainable yield. This is a concept coming out of wildlife biology and actually fisheries management. How much can we harvest from a population before we start to adverse effects on that population, right? And if you believe in the theory, there's actually an optimal point at which you can harvest the most number of animals and not impact the population, right? So you could take these sort of general mathematical equations that are associated with maximum sustainable yields, begin to ask, how much mortality can a population withstand from wind facilities before it begins to decline, right? And then you can compare that to these estimates of total killed and ask and throw in some stochasticity and you get an estimate of your probability of that happening. And then over here, there were some little maps that for some reason need to come up as a conversion, but no big deal. And over here would be more complex. There's a whole bunch of really complex ways ecologists model spatially explicit population dynamics. So you actually talk about individuals or populations of individuals that are linked across space and they move through time. So you include spatial dynamics as well as local dynamics all into one model. There's examples of this. There's a really interesting model being developed for whooping cranes right now. It's got flight migration stuff going on. It's got stopover locations. It's got a wind risk. It's got a collision risk model. Once you get in there, your probability of avoiding versus hitting. And it's got population dynamics, and it goes across the entire flyway from Texas all the way up to North Dakota. So it's spatially explicit, and it's really big, and it's really complex. We're not going to be able to do that for a national assessment because that takes 3 to 5 years to develop for just one species. So, but it's over there, and we talked about all those sort of things. Oh, there it is. Oh, it's been animated. Okay. Then we also talked a lot about these geographical approaches that I mentioned earlier. There's a number of people that are interested in just can we estimate risk in a relative kind of way from using more geographic approaches. So here's a coarse range map. I don't even know if it's right. I found it last night on the internet from some kind of database server at Purdue University or some weird, bizarre place. But I couldn't get the one from the Fish and Wildlife Service to download and load up in ARC, and I don't know why. So anyhow, this is a potential range map for the Indiana bat, and here it is overlaid with where there's wind development right now. Right? The Indiana bat is an endangered species, so you can, you can project, if this map was shifted way down here, so there's only 2 turbines across this entire range, you might say, there's not a lot of turbines affecting Indiana bats. If you got a bunch of facilities right in the middle of a species range, you got more something to concern about. So at the very, very far end of easy is just overlap between where the wind is versus where the species are. This is a much more complex model. This was recently presented. It's by Dr. Greg Forsey. He's with Normando Associates. He presented this at the meetings last week. But this is basically a risk map for a particular bat species, the silver-haired bat. This is a combination of 2 different hierarchical models, fairly complex statistical models that use a lot of geospatial data and link those with what we know about where this bat is, for example, and variables that explain where the bat occurs. So you first have a model of where the bat occurs. You have another model that is involved in where the wind might be, and you combine those 2 things together, and you get basically a risk map of where things might be happening. There's a lot of other ways you can do this sort of stuff. The wind energy guidelines, and we got a lot of feedback, particularly from the NGO community about habitat fragmentation and area-sensitive species. They're in these wind energy guidelines. A lot of people are concerned about the big road networks and stuff associated with wind facilities and those breaking up, large chunks of continuous habitat and what those impacts might be on species. We actually also got a lot of feedback from the industry about that. Some of them were saying, I've been forced to put radio transmitters on antelope, even though I don't think antelope are going to be impacted by roads. So, there was a lot of feedback and discussions about, can we figure out what these fragmentation sensitive species are and what the impacts might be. So the next steps is to obviously meet with a lot of partners, perform a literature review to identify these species that are basically sensitive to roads or habitat fragmentation. There's a massive, massive, massive literature on habitat fragmentation. I did my dissertation work on habitat fragmentation, and that was in the 80s, and there was a big literature then, and it's just gotten bigger. But we might be able to get at some of this via a literature review. And then we need to meet with a whole slew of subject matter experts. I'm probably going to go back in January and meet with DOE, the whole cadre of people in the DC area. We're trying to set up meetings with all of those folks. So then to wrap things up, there's a wide array of energy and wind-related research happening at USGS. I'm just one of multiple people involved. We have bat researchers. We have other people that are working on sort of larger landscape scale stuff, Southwest Wyoming, associated with all forms of energy development there. This National Wind Wildlife Assessment is open for your input. If you're an expert and you have some ideas, feel free to talk. USGS is a great place for student interns if you know of people that are looking for stuff. I would have been looking here if I had contacts here, but I had contacts at DU, so I picked up 4 that fast. And they're all making a decent amount of money and having fun. I would never want to digitize all those turbines, but they seem to be loving it. Feel free to contact me at any time, and thank you very much.
Well, I mean, I was thinking about the turbines.
Yeah.
Not just the facilities, but the turbines. And lots of them like species. Actually, GIS for location.
Yeah.
Or GIS for location of the turbines. So I think working with the WIA, and maybe you've already spoken with other national assessment project. But if there could be an opportunity to work through a WIA to get
to the weeds.
Get into the weeds and get that information. I guess the question here, are we looking for 100%?
That would be our goal if we can.
Yeah,
but
because I think there's certain companies that would be really
opposed.
Yeah, would do that information on the application, but there's other companies that probably would.
That's a good point.
And I was just thinking about the cost of the satellite imaging, but I guess it's piggybacking on something that's already happened.
Yeah, so I don't know the nuances of that contract we have with commercial satellite carriers. I think it's actually that the National Geospatial Agency has that contract, and we're able to tap into that. Right now, we've been told the imagery is free. Now, I told the folks that do the actual tasking of the satellites, we have 2 people in our office that are, I think, 2 of like the 3 people in all of the Department of Interior that are able to task satellites and send these things in. And I said, are we going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back here? Are we going to be the ones that someone from NGA says, enough from USGS, And they said, no, and we'll parse them out slowly through time, so it shouldn't be a problem. But we'll see how that goes. I mean, yeah. AWIA, I think, so John Anderson, who's the head of siting with AWIA, was at the meeting last week in Reston, and he and I chatted briefly about this. And we talked a little bit about it after the March meeting as well. And now that we're actually underway and funded, I do need to work on that a little bit more, because I really think that they're, particularly for the facilities level data. And when we go to places, you go to these places in the country where there's a whole bunch of wind all stacked up onto each other, the Tehachapi area, and some of these facilities have been purchased and sold and stuff like that. You just see this glob of points. And that there's, there might be 4,000 turbines in there, and that's supposed to be like maybe 15 or 30 facilities, but you have no idea, exactly, who the ownership, what the ownership pattern is, and I don't even know where we're going to get that without getting to energy company specific data or county permitting. And we might not be able to do it. We've talked about just developing our own sort of clustering algorithm, and at the spatial scale, we just say, you know, the big energy cluster in Texas, right, and give it a name, because there's a bunch of, you know, so these concentrations of locations. That would be the broadest spatial scale, and then try to get finer. But it's really tough. I mean, there's always states and counties.
Well, the seldom feature is the opportunity to build a business model that will help them in fighting.
I hope.
Reducing their costs.
That's right. And you know, that's the main message we got from our meeting with them actually earlier this week when we talked to industry folks about the national assessment. They're like, if you in your assessment can show that of the 4,000 passerines in America, we only have to worry about 20 of them, that will really help us when we go talk to Fish and Wildlife Service, right? Because they'll say, here's a USGS assessment that says we only need to really worry about 20, so please don't make us worry about these other ones that you want us to worry about. So they actually, oh, thanks, Compton. You usually get turbine sizes than ownership. Yeah, that's exactly right, Roger. It is. We can, yeah, it's very true. Yeah, Roger is in the middle of this battle, so to speak, and it's surprising to me that it's as I had no idea we were getting into such a hornet's nest when we decided to take this on.
Well, a decade ago, I worked on a database map for that identified the location of the project in the United States. There were some stupid that.
Yeah, I bet. Did you get it done?
Sorry?
Did you get it done? You were able to pull it off?
You know, it's never done.
That's true.
That's right. Decommissioning projects, and we're talking about
Mm-hmm.
you know, it's and all
right. Yeah.
It's not.
No, it's not.
I have a unique question. So, you need a permit installed in turbine.
In most cases, yes, depending on where you are, but yes.
Let's talk about Texas.
Yeah.
Okay, forget my question.
Yeah. So it depends on where you are. I mean, so Karen can answer this probably better than me, but when you get in, what I'm hearing from the industry is all the easy places to develop, places where you didn't need permits, places where there were landowners that were willing to give you a lease, etc., that those are beginning to dry up. And you're beginning to see companies think about putting stuff on federal lands. There's a number of requests now to build on BLM land, for example. Those all require a permitting process, NEPA and other things like that. And it's a lot more expensive for companies to develop in those places. But they're starting to look at them a little bit more. So what was your question, though, about permits?
I thought if you have a permit process, okay, you would still have to go maybe to the local community and ask them for maybe insight. Like you said, maybe they're not electronics.
Right.
I thought there would be a chance to get this stuff reliable, especially when we talk about the hospital permits where you want to track ownership.
Yeah.
I had another question. So you talked about this model where you had the essentially decline of black versus the
yes.
activity to well. How good are these models? And again, I can see there the problem is much bigger when we talk about blind species, because there the range of impact may be huge, and I can see that there might be turbine in the flight path or the migration path of the species, and you put it 10 miles to the east or west, and suddenly there might be a binary kind.
Right. Right.
How good are they fully understood, or?
I would argue they're not fully understood. I mean, Karen's been involved in the wind world much longer than me. But it sounds to me that really a really good set of empirical, a very nice empirical understanding of wind-wildlife interactions is still being developed right now. There's a few places like the Altamont wind sites in California where there's been a lot of ongoing raptor research for a very long time. And I think there they've got a pretty good understanding of even the sort of spatial scale at which the wind turbine affects local raptor populations. I think it's just eagles they really focus on. Is that right?
Well, it's eagles, it's also
birds. Okay, burrowing owls. That's right. That's right. So, but this conference last week, there's a lot of people that are working on some sage grouse and prairie chickens, and even songbirds, where they're beginning to measure sort of in transects at different distances away from a wind facility and asking, do we see evidence of some birds avoiding turbines or not? So you're beginning to get data sets like that available. There's a very interesting talk that was produced by a guy named Brett Sandercock, who's a faculty member at Kansas State, where he had transmitters on, I want to say prairie chickens, greater prairie chickens, and found that they actually did quite well right underneath turbines. And it might actually be because the predators that prey on them and their young are doing things differently under wind facilities that make it a little bit better for them. So there could be really complex biological things that take place. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. So whenever I think about what Karen just said, I say to myself, well, why did I sign up for this national assessment? Because it's going to be hard to do.
But then I guess, you know, at the end of the day, and somebody, I guess, this decision has to make a decision what is more important to encourage even versus critical development.
Exactly.
And then you add another level of certainty.
That's right. You nailed that on the head. I mean, yeah. You nailed it, right? You nailed it. That's one of the huge issues with this whole thing in terms of this comparative analyses, right? I mean, it was really interesting at this wind meeting with the NGO folks, because they all don't want climate change, so they all sort of want renewables. They want a non-fossil fuel-based energy source, I guess is the way to put it. At the same time, they have this very visceral reaction when they see a photograph of a beheaded, bird. And you can just almost see the internal conflict when they're sitting across the table talking to you. How do I do this?
Conversation started circulating around, what is this in the context of versus?
That's right.
Why are we focused on wind? When we know based on
That's right.
data that the number of birds killed from wind development, birds is very low compared to other sources that we know. But then we get into a bigger discussion about, well, we don't know the answers, it has to be the answer, and then you get there's a certain party saying, well, yeah, so what's the impact on coal and gas, whatever.
That's right. That's right.
And we went around in circles outside that.
It did. It went all over the place. Yeah, it did. And we got an earful from industry at our meeting. They still would like us to make this an assessment process that allows us to do comparisons across multiple forms of energy development. I mean, the wind energy, I'm new. I'm going to speak off the cuff, I guess, here. But it certainly seems to me that wind development, and I don't know if it's because it's this massive structure that everybody sees, or if it's because there's been so much history of other forms of energy development that we've just accepted. We accept the fact that we're going to have a few passerine birds run into our living room window and die every year. We all seem to accept that. We all seem to accept the fact that our house cats are going to bring home a dead carcass of a bird and put it at our doorstep every day, right? We seem to accept oil and gas without really thinking hard about its wildlife impacts. But you put up a big turbine that everybody sees and it kills three or four passerines, and there's a lot of to it for some reason. And I'm not convinced that environmental regulation is being equally enforced across the energy spectrum. I have no data on that. That's basically me hearing discussions from folks where I am. I've talked to BLM people that have told me that they know about migratory waterfowl that have landed in those frack water ponds and died. But you don't hear people shutting down a drilling operation because there's some dead ducks in the water there. But you do hear about wind turbine companies getting in trouble for things like that. So, that seems to be where we're at right now. So, all right, we're going to wrap it up?
Yep.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you very much for attending. And
thank you, Roger.
Sorry to not be able to hear the other side of the audience.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, sorry. Oh, thank you very much.